My name is Anna from Realty. Today we will be talking about rehabilitation in Portugal and the challenges and the way the market works from the perspective of someone that is actually working in it. Okay, so today I have here Thomas and Matthew from Realitejo, and they have been here for quite a few years and also bought this lovely property that they have been hands-on restoring themselves, and they will be telling us a bit about their experience here. So, how have you started with doing rehabilitation here in Portugal?
Well, we set Reabilitejo up 2 or 3 years ago now with two main objectives. One of those was to do some kind of strategic work with local authorities, with investors, or people looking at restoring kind of zones, partly abandoned villages, conservation areas, and that kind of thing. But with the pandemic over the last couple of years, that's proved really quite difficult to move forward on. So the other side of what we've been focusing on is work with private clients to help them, what we like to describe it as, is make better informed decisions about what properties to buy, particularly where they're older, and then how to go about restoring them. So typically that starts with us carrying out a survey for the client, which is really very much about not just what the problems are with the property, but how you can sort them out, how you can fix them in a way that's going to make the property comfortable for future living. My background is operational and project management, whereas Matthew is the technical side of things.
That's right. I've worked for many years in local government in the UK. I was writing kind of policies for the conservation and enhancement of the historic environment. And since coming here, I've done a couple of courses. The first at Coimbra, studying with the sun urban, and the latterly at ESL, the engineering school in Lisbon, and that's specifically on the kind of technical aspects of building conservation. So from my kind of career trajectories includes the whole holistic approach to rehabilitation, which is not only looking at how buildings stay up, but the policy aspects, the cultural aspects, the environmental aspects, and the social aspects. And I think those are all important things to consider when dealing with urban rehabilitation. And it's quite interesting that we talk about rehabilitation. It's not a term that we use in local government in England. And I gather it's not really something that a lot of people know about here as well. It's just something that came in during the early part of the 21st century. We're talking
Never
about...
really thought about that, but you're right.
Yeah. Well, because we've spoken to a lot of people, we say we're doing rehabilitation counsellors. And they say, oh no, but here you only talk about rehabilitation of the body, but actually it's the same kind of metaphor for the city, for the house. You're thinking of it as a living, breathing, organic entity. And I think that's where we try to help inject the kind of spirit of rehabilitation, not only in property, but having a wider impact as well.
And I fully agree with you. I also have very much that kind of approach on my own company, not being just about buying property itself, but actually finding a match when it comes to location and so on, because that makes so much difference. As someone that also had a bit of exploration yourselves, you were just telling me that you were planning on going to Lisbon first, but then you ended up really liking it here, even though it wasn't your first plan. And that kind of thing is perfectly normal. Also, most of my clients go through that. Many of them come here thinking they want to go to a location and end up in a completely different one. So that's such an important part of the process, and it's exactly about what you just said. It's about a social and cultural aspect and a match, just feeling comfortable on where you end up. So yes. That's definitely a very important thing. The first thing that I think we should talk about is exactly the buying process. And we also discussed this previously, and how easy it is to end up buying something and not being able to do what you want. And that's something that a buyer should be really careful about. So what would be your advice for someone that is looking for property to renovate and buy?
Well, I think the first step is really to look at the land that the property sits on, whether it's got a lot of land or just what it immediately has, in terms of whether that gives you the opportunity to build, rebuild or restore what you think you can. The second part that's linked to that is really about the habitation license or otherwise of the buildings on it, in terms of whether you can, again, live in whatever you create. There is a risk otherwise, and of course you know this and you'll be advising the people you work with, but there's a risk otherwise that you buy something that looks like it might be a house, but ends up being something that really can't ever be your home. So that's a critical first step before you even get to the condition of the building. The second bit then really is what you're seeing what you think it is in terms of the condition, the structural state and that kind of thing. Part of this, what's really important, is getting a real person to go and look at it. I know a lot of people at the moment are looking to buy properties from a distance. They're dead keen, understandably, to buy somewhere that they can move over to. But there's lots of potential pitfalls in buying something that actually turns out to be a long-term headache. So again, talk to your realtor, but also get somebody who's independent of anybody involved in the selling to look at it. If it's quite new, that doesn't need to be a formal survey. It might just be another pair of eyes. But if you're looking at something that is older, you're bound to find some hidden surprises. Obviously, one of the things I've mentioned that we do is surveys, but this isn't about using us specifically, though we'd love you to. It's really get somebody who knows about the property to look at it. Portuguese construction is quite different to most of Northern European, North American construction in its type and in the way that buildings are put together. So it's really helpful to have somebody who knows what they're looking at. I think those are the couple of key first steps. Then the next most important thing is think about your timeline. Is it important that you need to get into that property within 6 months, a year, 2 years? Because the amount of work involved is going to relate to that. And one of the things that people moving to Portugal tend to find is you need to overestimate, if you like, the amount of patience and the amount of time you're going to need for the work to happen. It's in some ways a stereotype, but particularly in the current climate, there's lots of this.
It's kind of a true one, but
yes. It is a kind of a true one, and it's just really important that you don't say, I need to be in there by Christmas, and then find that you haven't got anywhere to be at Christmas because the place isn't ready for you. Just make sure you take that right decision, and a good realtor, a good surveyor, a good other professional in the construction industry can help you with that. And I should say, linked to that first point around the documents, always make sure you've got a lawyer who can check these things out for you as well. It's really important to find somebody. They don't need to be expensive, they don't need to be flashy, they just need to understand property.
Yes, and I fully agree with you, and that's one of the ways that my service is structured. So everything goes through a lawyer, and we always include an inspection of property, and that's usually with a third party, unless it's something new that I just need to inspect the documentation and so on, and just doesn't justify to bring someone over. But yes, actually I've been over this recently, and one of the biggest problems in real estate in Portugal is lack of due diligence in general, and that's both by the agents and by the buyer, just checking everything, because there are so many variants, and especially when it comes to rehabilitation, you probably come across situations like these too. A very, very common thing with old properties is that the registry isn't updated, so the house is bigger than it's what's registered, and then it's kind of complicated to get everything licensed, and you only can license new things after the old ones are licensed.
Yep.
And it can be a whole mess, so you really, really need to be careful with this.
Yes. Yeah, the professional fees at the early stages of this are sometimes frustrating to people who just want to get there, but they'll save you money, they'll save you time, they'll save you stress, and they're a really small part of what you're ultimately going to be spending.
And in truth, the legal costs in Portugal aren't that high compared to many other countries. I do include that in my services, just FYI. But if you just go and hire a lawyer privately, compared to other places, lawyers in Portugal are quite cheap.
Yes.
Except in Lisbon. Everything in Lisbon is more expensive, but that's an exception to the rule.
Well, it's just knowing all of this information in advance, because when you know, a lot of these things are very easy to address. I mean, let's take this place as an example. It was in a legal state called Propriedad Horizontal, whereby it's divided into several different fractions. And of course, going into that, if you owning, let's say, one fraction wants to make changes, generally you have to get the agreement of the other, everybody else. So if you didn't know that, you could buy something, want to do something, but then you couldn't.
Yes.
Yeah.
But so you know that, you make an informed decision, you either kind of buy all the other fractions or kind of negotiate with the other parties, and if you can't, then you kind of walk.
But you need to know that up front, as you say, and it's quite a different arrangement, certainly to the UK. That kind of setup doesn't really exist there. I think it does exist in other countries, but it works a bit differently. And of course, the link point on that is you can end up with a property. It may be a single building, it may be a kind of an assembly of various buildings, some of which the actual owners are not easily available or not even known, and that can cause complications
that's
as well.
one of the very common problems with older properties. In most cases it's inheritances, and in many cases it's already diluted between a lot of heirs, and some of them don't really care about it anymore, and it can be a mess. Another thing that often happens is some of them put them on the market without getting the permission from all them, so when you actually get to the sale, in truth, it's not ready to be sold.
Yeah, and that's there's a frustration which isn't so much on the rehabilitation front, but linked to property prices. That we quite often get asked, well, why is one property this amount and another one's 25% of that? And sometimes it's because you've got a situation with a set of heirs who have decided what they want, and that's it, and that's the agreement they were able to come to, and it's 200,000 or it's 25,000, and it doesn't have to make sense to you. You can choose to go with that or not. Is the property worth it to you? And that brings me back to that point around just make sure that whatever it is you want out of that property is something you're going to be able to achieve before you start, because otherwise it might not be.
Yes, and it's a very good idea to have a good understanding of the timeline and costs before you actually buy it.
Yes.
Because especially on the cost side with rehabilitation, it's very, very easy to spend a lot more than you were initially planning.
Yes.
Oh, certainly. You can get all of the quotes that you want, but when it comes to it, with the spiralling costs of materials, with the shortage of tradespeople, and other issues that you possibly haven't considered until you take the ceiling off and realise actually this needs much more reinforcement than you thought. Hence the importance of some kind of survey. But even then, the cost of materials are often out of our hands.
Well, and I think it's sense checking of the kind of quotes you're getting, because we've had experiences quite recently of a particular house that needed some work, not our one in this context, but somewhere else, and the quotes varied from 30,000 to I think it's something like 120,000 for the same overall job, and that's a huge difference. And you need to get somebody to kind of help you interpret that. In that particular instance, what it seemed to be is that the contractor with the really high bill didn't want to do some bits of the job. So a lot of what they broke down was perfectly reasonable. And then there was a huge chunk in some stuff which I imagine they didn't need to outsource, or they didn't have the skills for, or they just didn't want to touch.
Sometimes, unfortunately, if they see foreigners, they just hope that they are able to pay and give you much higher quotes. That occasionally also happens, which is not a good indicator of ethics, but it's known to happen.
Yeah, it can do. I mean, I think our experience is that actually there are very few people here who are genuinely trying to rip people off in Portugal. It's not culturally a thing. That said, people will see an opportunity from time to time and see what they can do with that.
Well, yes, in Portugal there's kind of a saying like, you only are a thief if you get caught, and that's very much a mindset often. And that applies especially to government. Lots of people learning from government stuff. Yes.
But it's really quite interesting when talking about government, the case of Socrates. That government, okay, there were some massive issues, but in terms of advancing the cause of, firstly, land registry, which still, we still don't have complete cadastro predial land registry, and in terms of rehabilitation, that was the government that really kind of launched that legislation. So sometimes thieves can do good things.
That's actually true. Yes.